So just to say a really big welcome and thank you for joining today's masterclass, which is hosted by the NIHR School for Primary Care Research. For those of you I haven't met before, I'm Hallie. I'm the Public Involvement and Engagement Manager for the school, and I'll be helping to chair the session today. Just before we begin, a few quick housekeeping points. So we're recording the session. This will be available on our YouTube channel shortly after we finish. We'll also share the slides with everyone who's registered as well. As we are expecting quite a large number of attendees, I think we're over 100 already. We've muted microphones and we've switched cameras off just to minimize background noise and to kind of avoid distractions. But if you do have any questions, we've opened up the Q&A section. So this is a separate tab, different to the chat. Posting questions here just helps us keep on top of them a little bit more. They do get lost in the chat sometimes. And I do think it allows you to upvote questions. So if we're short on time, we can focus on the ones that are most important to you. Of course, if you'd prefer to ask your question verbally as well, you can use the raise hand function and we can unmute you so you can come in. The chat is still there, so do feel free to introduce yourself so we've got a sense of who's joining us today. And yeah, I think that covers all the housekeeping. So I'm really delighted to introduce our speaker today. So Megan Armstrong, who's an associate professor of primary care research and deputy director of the Center for Aging Population Studies at UCL. So Megan's work focuses on tackling health inequalities and particularly supporting people experiencing socioeconomic deprivation who live with multiple long-term conditions. We're really excited to hear some insights from her work, along with practical tips and strategies for overcoming common barriers to involvement and participation. So Megan, thank you so much for being here, and I'll hand it over to you to take forward.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. And you can hear me all okay? Yeah.
Yes.
Brilliant. Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to give this talk. It's great that so many people have turned up for it. It seems like this is something then that's on a lot of our minds. So my aim today is to give a real brief overview of who I am and the work I'm doing, and then I'm going to talk about some of the barriers and solutions that I found that's worked, as well as sort of speaking about some of the wider literature that's out there. So I actually had quite a personal journey into inequalities research. I grew up in East London. I grew up in East London on a council estate. In fact, it's the exact block of flats that you can see in that image. So I was from a very working class community, and we experienced, as a community, various forms of deprivation. So I saw there sort of really firsthand how these inequalities impacted my community. I then went on to do a psychology degree and started to gain an understanding of why people behave the way they do, why they think the way they do, and how people in general make sense of the environments that they're in. I went on to do a PhD, and that was very much around applying psychology to health questions. And I've become even more fascinated around social theory and understanding different groups and how we identify and how that impacts our behaviour. I've become really interested in that. So now I sit in primary care research, and I've been doing that for a number of years. And I really, again, have kept seeing the impact of how socioeconomic deprivation impacts people's health and the health journeys that they go on. So I've been involved in lots of different research around inequalities, but I mainly work on supporting people from this population to self-manage their multiple long-term conditions. It's recognising the fact that 99% of people's time is managing those health conditions alone. It's not in front of a healthcare professional, and it's how can we develop and evaluate approaches that make self-management realistic and sustainable, really, for this population. I've got an upcoming chapter coming out in August 2026. It's a bit of a shameless plug for the book, really. It's in a book on understanding race and health inequity in the UK. I think it's going to be a fantastic book. I've read the other chapters. I'm not the expert on race, but I co-wrote this with Danielle Nimmons and Abby Woodward, who do more research on this. But I applied that socioeconomic deprivation lens. So I'm also really interested in how we can support people with cognitive impairment. So this is something that we know is higher in this population, and Tasmin Rooks is doing a postdoc on this and doing some really interesting work around that. And I'm also involved in some work around digital health inclusion. I think particularly since COVID, and a lot of health appointments and things like that started to go online, that digital inequality sort of really become apparent, and then the new 10-year plan to make everything analog to digital means that I'm going to be involved in lots of research around that. I'm also interested in how we can reduce frailty and multiple long-term condition burden among people who are experiencing homelessness, as well as how they can access health, social and palliative care. I'm not going to spend long on this slide, but I am really interested in how we can embed inclusion, not just in research, but across academia for students and staff. So to this end, I'm involved in various different work streams of research, including being a principal investigator on supporting the progression and well-being of working class women in academia. I'm really interested in being involved in sort of EDI work at the institute level, because I think if we're going to address inequalities outside of academia, we need to address the inequalities that is going on within academia. So moving on then to what we're all here for, which is really how we can engage better with people experiencing socioeconomic deprivation. I think if there was one take home from this talk I was going to give, it's to remain curious at all times. I'm always learning more ways to be inclusive, and I'm willing to be wrong. And I think what I'm going to discuss today is what's worked for me in my research and the research I've conducted. But you may need to take other approaches, and I think it's really recognising that one size doesn't fit all. And I think sometimes we can be very well-meaning but get it wrong. So it's just being open to that fact and changing our approaches, and always being reflective about what's working and then what's not working so well. So what do we mean by socioeconomic deprivation, sometimes referred to as status, position, disadvantage? So despite it being really well covered and researched, there's actually no real standard definition, and it is debated exactly what it means within the research. So what we typically refer to is a lack of social, economic and material resources that are required to ensure overall well-being and a good standard of living. So social, we're referring to people's networks. Are they stable? Are people able to participate in community life? Do they have access to accurate information and guidance? Economics, so their income, their access, to wealth, to secure employment, as well as material. So, housing, is the housing appropriate? Can they access nutritious food, heating, suitable clothing and transportation and things like that? It's supposed to be a measure of a current situation, and therefore in theory changeable. So someone could go from being on a low income to a good income, or someone could go from being on a high income to a low income. I'm going to briefly mention social class, because what I've noticed is that they're often used interchangeably sometimes, but it's actually more of a complex relationship. So I find that in policy and media, they'll tend to talk about class, working class communities. In research, they tend to talk about socioeconomic deprivation or status, but often meaning the same thing. So I think it's just recognising that those terms can be used interchangeably, but it is more of a complex relationship. So class refers to someone's stable cultural background, so their group membership, how they identify, what are the norms, how they behave, how do they socialise, and all those different aspects. But I'm certainly not an expert, so I always recommend speaking to a sociologist who understands the complexities between the two. So why research this area at all? Health inequalities across social groups has been around for a long, long time. And I don't really have time to go into the history here, but I think a turning point in research was probably around 50 years ago when Richard Wilkinson wrote to the Labour Secretary of State for Social Services and essentially said that almost all major causes of death, including heart disease, stroke, lung cancer, stomach cancer, cervical cancer, pneumonia, bronchitis, are 2 to 3 times more common among unskilled manual workers than among senior professional workers. And that the overall death rate between them two is 50% higher for those who are in the unskilled manual workers, and then raise this as sort of a national urgent inquiry that they needed to do. So there were reports after that. In the 80s, there was the Black report that come out. There's been the Marmot reports. There's been lots of research into this that is essentially showing the same pattern. But unfortunately, not much has changed. So life expectancy stalled for the first time since the start of the 1900s. So death rates have fallen steadily up until 2010. But then the fall was always greater in the more privileged classes. But this is the first time it's stalled. Life expectancy follows the social gradient. So the more deprived you are, the shorter the life expectancy. The more affluent you are, the longer life expectancy. But there is also a north-south divide in our country, in England. So the most deprived areas of London still have a 5-year higher average age of living than the most deprived areas in the north. And despite all this, the national government has not prioritised, I don't think, health inequalities in any meaningful way, despite these really concerning trends. So there was the English Health Inequality Strategy, which was a cross-government national strategy implemented throughout, sort of, I suppose, when Tony Blair came into power until 2010. But there's been lots of peer-reviewed sources now that have said that strategy effectively ended in 2010 when the coalition government came into power, the Lib Dems and the Conservatives. And then since then, there's been some initiatives. So there'll be things like, there was All Our Health, there's Core 20+5, Levelling Up, but they're not equivalent to a sort of a comprehensive national strategy at all. And I don't think, by the looks of it, that's going to change anytime soon. But despite these sort of seemingly everlasting and very avoidable inequalities, this population are systematically excluded from research. So evidence shows they're consistently underrepresented in research across all different areas. So clinical trials, epidemiology data and analysis, public health, social science, all different areas. And national surveys and systematic reviews consistently find that this population are less likely to be invited to take part in these trials, or even if they're invited, they're less likely to enrol in the trials. And then when they do enrol, they're more likely to drop out. And we also know that our national research infrastructure is really biased. The UK Biobank, for example, disproportionately sampled educated and well-off volunteers. So I think only about 5% of people who were invited took up the opportunity to take part, and they were healthier, more educated and wealthier than the general population, which leads to really poor science. Our evidence base becomes really biased, our conclusions are inaccurate, and the results therefore aren't particularly generalisable. So not only is it a moral issue that we should include this population in research, it's actually just good science. So I would like to show a short video. I'm going to see if this works. It's only 4 minutes long, and I think it was a video that I created. We co-designed with the population alongside my my colleague Abby Woodward. I'm not actually in the video because I was heavily pregnant at the time, but I'm going to stop sharing my screen and then I'm going to try and play this video. And if it doesn't work, it doesn't matter. The link's there for people to watch whenever they would like. But I think it's best to hear from the population instead of just me. Right, so, share, optimize, and let me play.
I'm Abby Woodward. I'm a researcher at the Department of Primary Care and Population Health at UCL, and I'm really pleased to be able to share this video with you today, which highlights the project looking at people who have long-term health conditions who are also experiencing socioeconomic deprivation and the barriers that they face to getting involved in health research. We ran a public engagement project funded by the UCL engagement team where we spoke to people with long-term health conditions who are also experiencing socioeconomic deprivation. We asked them about the potential barriers of getting involved in research.
I think it's important for people on low incomes and living in deprived areas to get involved in research because they have lots of different long-term conditions. They live in cramped conditions in highly and densely populated areas. There are pollution factors. They don't necessarily have access to services. A lot of the time things are done to us and they're not done necessarily with us in mind.
I think every population needs to be included in the research because low-income families is a big chunk of the populations. If we avoid or ignore them, you can't get the real fact of the research data.
The thing is sometimes distance, language barrier, and as well as I will add again diversity.
What would put people off from getting involved in research from SED backgrounds would be that they don't relate to the people that are carrying out the research. They can't really see the outcomes. They don't get to know about them. And they're not sure if it relates to them, and they're worried about the comebacks.
I think transport cost is the main factors, plus language problems, plus lack of knowledge, because sometimes they don't know about the research going on, and lack of campaigning. The researchers not campaigning in low-income areas, so they never heard of it.
Way to get people into health research is to have people that reflect their backgrounds who are doing the research, to know that clinicians and policymakers are going to listen to and read the research and actually make sure that they do something about it, and just to feel engaged and people reach out to them. So it's a two-way process.
Or if you do research with the low-income families, you need to go with the low-income borough. Like Tower Hamlets have a deprived borough, there's lots of poor families there. You need to go them and reach them. You need to campaign them to reach that families.
More awareness, because even myself, I don't know before what research is.
So some of the research activities I've been involved in are with, for example, the Roehampton University and English National Ballet. They've been doing research on musical movement and Parkinson's. So for my mum and for me, it's been great to actually do this and see some improvement in my mum's condition, and also know that actually we are part of something that could very well make a difference.
I'm going to stop sharing there because it's just about finished, and I'm going to go back to sharing my slides. Someone shout out if you don't see my slides when I start presenting them. Okay, fantastic. So yeah, I really liked that video. I mean, there was things I'll change about it now as we keep going on, but I think it was really great just to have the population speak for themselves and advocate for themselves. There we are. So there's lots of different reasons for exclusion, and I haven't got time to cover them all. There are sort of the logistical constraints, so transportation, no compensation, trial hours that are within the working day, and people might work and not have the flexibility to say, oh, I need an hour off to go take part in this interview or this study. There can often be quite restrictive eligibility criteria, so no additional health conditions is quite a common one. And we know that this population tends to be living with several long-term health conditions. There can be poor outreach, gatekeeper assumptions. Again, lots of research that, for example, doctors are much more likely to even unconsciously refer people who are more affluent into studies. And then there's one huge barrier to overcome, which is mistrust. There is a lot of mistrust with people going and doing research in these communities. So I'll come back to that later on, how I think some of the ways that we can overcome that are. So strategies to improve inclusion. It seems a really obvious aspect, but research funders actually rarely enforce socioeconomic diversity in their research. Journals likewise do not require you to provide, often don't require you to provide data on the socioeconomic deprivation breakdown. So what we tend to find is, unless the research question is specifically around socioeconomic deprivation, it's then not measured like ethnicity, age and gender might be. So these are the common ways you can measure it. So income, this is obviously a direct measure of the economic and likely material resources, and it's sensitive to short-term change, but it doesn't capture things like wealth, debt, unstable income, and it also doesn't capture their social environment. Education is another one that's commonly used. It's a strong predictor of health literacy, employment opportunities, and whether they're likely to be experiencing socioeconomic deprivation in the future. The cons of this is that it might not be particularly accurate. I think particularly it's a complex relationship for older populations, and we know that now about 50% of young people are going to university, so it's how much actually does education impact socioeconomic deprivation now? I'm not actually quite sure. You can measure it through occupation, tends to reflect people's social status and standing, and also their working conditions and the autonomy they've got around their employment, but it can mask variations in income. And then you've got the index of multiple deprivation. So that's based on people's postcodes, and people are ranked between, the areas are ranked between areas from 1 to 10, from most affluent to least affluent, and it's weighted on things like income, employment. That's it. I think it's 50% weighted by that, and then the other 50% is things like crime, barriers to housing, disability, things like that. The challenge with that one is it's definitely an area level. It's not an individual level measure of deprivation, and people often use it to be an individual level, but it's estimated between about 25 to 50% of people are misclassified when you use it. So you can be, not personally experiencing deprivation, living in a deprived area, or you could be experiencing deprivation and not living in a deprived area, or the other way around. So essentially not a great individual level measure. There's also other ways to measure it. So the census tend to use a scale called the National Statistics Social Economic Classification, which is largely based on occupation. But those are the most common ways in research. And just a quick note to say that it does vary. So if you're doing a systematic review or any kind of review and you're looking at research across different countries, it does vary by the country and what sort of measures they'll use. For example, I've done a lot of work looking at the research going on in the US, and they tend to, they'll measure sort of whether they've got access to health insurance, for example. So my recommendations are to keep advocating to measure social economic deprivation, particularly when the research isn't actually even focused on it. We should always be capturing it to see who's included in all the different clinical trials, or qualitative, all the different types of research. So keep advocating for it to be measured. As there is no agreed measure, I would recommend, obviously the more data you can collect on people, the better, but obviously there's a pragmatic decision between not wanting to exhaust people before they've even got to your actual outcome measures. So I would always recommend trying to use more than one indicator if you can. I think capturing industry index of multiple deprivation is useful because it shows that structural disadvantage around them and that will impact their daily lives. But I'd always try and pair it at an individual level where possible. So probably income. But I think what is most important is to ask yourself the question, what are you trying to understand around social economic deprivation? Is it their material deprivation? Is it around life changes, people who might have found themselves being in a high income to a low income? So if you're doing research around carers, you find that people's income changes. Is it more around their cultural capital or that structural disadvantage? And I think really use that to then pick which would be the most accurate measure. And then also acknowledge the limitations. So when we talk about social economic status, we talk in terms of a lack of income, a lack of education, occupation that's not skilled, or living in an area of deprivation. And we are creating categories for this population who we consider socially and economically advantaged or disadvantaged. And I understand why we're trying to do this, because we're trying to fix the problem, but I think we need to recognise that we are solely looking at this population through a deficit lens, and I don't think that's particularly helpful. So I think we always need to acknowledge that. Which leads me on to be aware of and challenge when you see the stigma and stereotypes around this population. So we know that there is a huge lack of representation of this population, for example, in our media, but they are a segregated population. They live in different postcodes typically. Their children won't go to school with our children. They might not be in our same occupation as us by the very definition. So we need more representation. And what we know in the media, for example, so the BBC did a report in 2020, and they said that people experiencing social economic deprivation or from working class backgrounds are often depicted negatively and are the object of ridicule on TV. And the BBC they went on quite quickly to say it wasn't just them, it was across the board. And then we know that, 90% of writers in the UK creative industries and 80% of journalists come from middle or upper class backgrounds. So one of the examples in the top right hand corner, or it's my right hand corner, is a still from, it was Little Britain, and Little Britain was problematic for lots of reasons. But there was a character they played in which they sort of mocked a very working class woman, I suppose. And I think it's just worth recognising that this was written and acted by two privately educated people, and that is not uncommon within the media. And then you've got the sort of examples of our newspapers are always sort of stigmatising this population. So I think it is really important to consider that there are constant stereotypes of them that is ongoing. And then the impact is that the people from these populations are more likely to be associated with negative traits and criminality. So this was a study done in Cambridge last year, I think. And what they found is that the stereotypes were things like unintelligent, less trustworthy, wasteful, overly authentic. I find that one unusual, but I do come on to later why I think that was seen as negative. But yeah, I was quite surprised. And then they're seen as more likely to be involved in all aspects of criminality except sex crimes. That was the only area where they weren't. That was more middle class and upper class people were more considered to be that was more fitting with them. So policies then become built around deficit rather than structural explanations and assets. And it leads to further segregation. So despite this, class or social economic status is not a protected characteristic. So therefore, there's no legal requirement for organisations to monitor it, report on it, or take action when discrimination occurs. So in that circle there, you can see there are 9 categories of protected characteristics. So the inequalities for this population and how to resolve them remain largely invisible because we don't actually know the scale. So as I mentioned at the start, I'm doing some work around working class women in academia, but you can't get any numbers on how many people are working class in academia because it's not collected in data. So the British Psychological Society did a report in 2022, and there's a link here if you want to read the full report. I mean, it's lengthy, it's about 50 pages, but it is a really interesting report. And they said that in the UK, discrimination based on someone's social class or socioeconomic status is immune from direct challenge, and for too long, the damaging impacts of social class inequalities and discriminations have been ignored. The psychological evidence in our report is clear. Class-based differences in structural, economic, environmental and material conditions are hugely significant for health and well-being across all areas of people's life. And I think this makes it even more important that we are collecting this data and we are challenging those stereotypes when we come across them. So, some suggestions I've got are to acknowledge that we might have biases. These might be unconscious. I think UCL do an implicit bias training, but I haven't done it in a long time. But I definitely think that this should be something that's also discussed in those types of training. I think we need to increase knowledge of who they are and recognise that we might not have much accurate exposure to the population. So go into these communities and spending time with them, as well as reading, writing from them. So I've put some examples here of books that I have absolutely loved, and there are many, many more out there. But as I said, this on average, this will only make up, say, 10% of the books that are out there, but I really recommend reading these stories. These are all sort of autobiographical, but they do talk about the structural challenges as well. And then be explicit about our own positionality. So reflect on our class background or where our social economic status is now and how participants might interpret that. I think being reflective is really, really important. So let me just check how we're doing for time. Okay. Another point would be to always be intersectional. So Professor Kimberly Crenshaw wrote about this at the end of the 80s and proposed this theory about intersectionality. And I think it's a term we're starting to use a little bit more and reflect on. But I don't actually think, again, a bit like social economic status, when you drill down to what actually do you mean, where's it come from? Where's this stem from? There's often little knowledge. So this was based on some work that Crenshaw did looking at legal cases, and I'm going to give one example really quickly here. So Emma de Grafenred was representing a group of Black women, and she brought forward a discrimination claim against their ex-employer, General Motors, and said they were made redundant because they were Black women. So they put forward, this was a legal case, and they said that it was based on race discrimination and sex discrimination at the time. But it's thrown out of court, and they say, no, General Motors said we can't be sexist because look at all the women we employ, and we can't be racist, look at all the Black people we employ. So it's thrown out. They said we legally do not recognise Black women as a specific category, it's sex or it's race. And there were lots of examples around this. So Crenshaw did some fantastic work around intersectionality and the fact that oppression, there are unique oppression experiences for people who sit within more than one social category. I think we need to know that its roots are in Black feminism. That is where it stemmed from. And it continues in social movements today. So one of them was, this come around, I think around 10 years ago, Say Her Name, which was because mainstream discussions of police brutality were focusing largely on Black men and leaving the experiences of Black women largely invisible. So it's about recognising that people's lives are shaped by multiple identities. But these identities do not operate separately. So there's no use going and researching women and then going and researching Black people and expecting to know what are the experiences of Black women, for example. So it's really about understanding it's not just additive. You can't just add up these different types of these experiences because they are unique. So therefore research and policy really needs to be context specific, not one size fits all. So some suggestions: know its roots and its meaning. Like, let's not erase Crenshaw and the work that she did when we discuss intersectionality. She was a real pioneer in this area and still is. Examine which groups your sampling or methods may exclude, and just be acknowledge that. I think even if we start there, what groups are being excluded is a good starting point. And then consider how socioeconomic deprivation does intersect with race, disability, gender identity, age and sexuality, and other social groups. Engage with communities with lived experience early, so that you've got multiple voices that shape the question's interpretation, not just one PPI member. Have a group. And look for subgroup differences that reveal that compound inequalities and what it means for people. So you've decided your research question and you know how you're going to measure it, and you're going to think intersectional, but now you need to actually go out and recruit people. And I think there's lots of resources out there, and I'll flag some that can support with how to do this. But I think it's recognising that I've had no luck recruiting people through, for example, primary care. And there is evidence that this population tend to learn of research actually through their communities or through social media and those other avenues, as opposed to through primary and secondary care. So, think about how to creatively recruit different populations, and, don't just rely on primary and secondary care where possible. So in 2020, I was given some money to explore people experiencing social deprivation and socioeconomic deprivation and their experiences of multiple long-term conditions. So I know from the evidence and the research that recruitment barriers around primary and secondary care, there are challenges. So I decided I want to put up flyers in community venues, health centres, etc. And it becomes really apparent that socioeconomic deprivation is a very academic category, and that we apply to people, and it's not a term people identify with. So I went back to the funder and I said, could I recruit working class people? Because I'm quite interested in culture anyway, and I could just advertise, are you working class? But the funder said that there could be difficulties with misclassification and to stick with socioeconomic status. So I worked with a PPI group who I will acknowledge much preferred talking around class, because this was something that they were more proud of, but recognised that the kind of constraints of the funder. And they helped me come up with a set of questions that we could put on this advertisement. And these are them. I'm not saying they're perfect or gold standard, but I think working with your PPI group is really important. So we said that people had to identify one of the following: either no further education or I think we've said, no further education or training beyond the age of 16. They felt like they were just getting by or having difficulties affording the necessities I need in daily life, or are currently unemployed looking for work, or earning lower wages than need to get by. So we spent a lot of time discussing these, and we went, back and forth around the terminology we used and how it's kind of stigmatizing, and we acknowledge that all of these focus on the deficit of those people. But you do have to start thinking about how, if you're putting up your flyers and your posters and things like that, how you refer to this group, and how you I think there's a bit of work that needs to be done there that bridges that gap. I'm going to briefly say that we need to sort of obviously have inclusive study designs. I'm not going to go through them all, because there is a fantastic talk and slides on this link. Slide is going to be shared, so you can click on the link. It's mainly around trials, but I think a lot of it will apply to other sorts of study designs around how around how you can be more inclusive in your actual study design, making sure you compensate them for their time fairly, you work flexibly around their working hours, things like that. There's lots of great tips within that framework, so I really recommend accessing that. I think we need to recognise that we know that this population are more likely to experience childhood trauma or current trauma. I mean, being in poverty is a trauma in itself. We know that also experiencing trauma as a child is more likely to increase your risk of experiencing deprivation in adulthood. The relationship goes both ways. And there is a talk here, a TED talk, a fantastic talk by Nadine Burke-Harris, who explains this fantastically and the importance of us understanding that in health research. Again, really recommend listening to Nadine talk about that. So I think what we need to do is to make sure we are, you know, not everyone we research from this population will have experienced trauma, of course, but if we go from a point of they may have, then our research is going to work for everyone. So we need to create emotional, physical and cultural safety. So we need to explain the process clearly. We need to let participants have control. We need to check in regularly. Is this okay? Do you want to take a break? Have a distress protocol. And hold sessions in safe, familiar community spaces. And, you know, keep asking, what can we do to make you feel comfortable and evolve? Have a you know, a distress protocol or a protocol in general that evolves as you find more things out. And there's some fantastic resources on how to do trauma-informed research guide here that I've linked, and some references that I think are really worth reading. And from that practical guide, I've sort of taken an image, sort of a screenshot of some of the things that you can think about, you know, for example, during an interview. It is mainly for observational and qualitative research, but I think, again, it's always of value reading it through. We know that I want to touch on co-design because it's becoming much more prominent in research, particularly when we're working with underserved groups, and it is, you know, it is a fantastic method to use. It helps shape research questions and methods and language. It helps us identify the barriers and build practical solutions. And I think when communities start to see that they're actually being listened to and we're acting on that, it's viewed as relevant and respectful to them. And I think that's going to keep increasing engagement and retention as we move forward. It centres, we hopefully can try starting to centre their strengths and their assets and their context. And it can also help with meaningful dissemination. Again, there's so many resources out there on how to do co-design well. I didn't feel there was value in me particularly going through it today. I've put some links there. There's the UCL co-production. They're fantastic, really helpful if you want to reach out to them. Scottish co-production network, you don't have to be Scottish to access it. It's really useful. And then there's, if you want to co-design policy, there's some relevant links there, as well as how to use creative methods and some step-by-step guides of those creative methods. They're not just for academics, so you might need to pick out what's useful to you. And of course, working with peer researchers, this has been so important for my research. I work closely with a peer researcher. She started as a PPI member back in 2020, and we still work together today. And we've really built up a really great relationship. It helps you reach communities that researchers often miss. They bring that lived experience and credibility and trust. It can help participants feel understood and validated rather than scrutinised, and it can help make research feel safer and more authentic. And there's also lots of other benefits to doing it. And I've put some resources here. I did some fantastic training a few weeks back. There was a cost attached, but quite rightly so, because it's excellent training by the Young Foundation. I really think it is so valuable doing some training, and there's some links there for just some reading around sharing power and how you can do that. I think my tips are treated with the same respect as other methods, so therefore attend training. It's surprising how many researchers think they can do this and not have done any kind of meaningful training. I wouldn't expect that with any other method, so I think we treat it with the same respect. We highlight the benefits to our networks, and we critique different approaches. You know, not all co-design is created equal. Sometimes co-design is just consultation and it's not the same thing. So it's around challenging that. So I'm coming to the end of my talk, and I just want to start with with how we build trust. And it's an ongoing thing, and I think we need to build trust at the individual level. We also need to build trust at the institutional level. So we should be transparent about who we are, why we're doing the research, and how the findings will be used. Avoid patronising terms, and I kind of feel like anyone on the call now or anyone who's watching this video will know these things. So maybe actually it's more about calling it out when you witness it. I recognise that's easier perhaps as you get a bit more senior to be able to do that, but yeah, it's probably more around advocating that actually that's an outdated term or things like that. Work with voluntary community and faith organisations. They've already got trust with these communities, and I think before we sort of parachute ourselves into these communities, we should work with organisations, safe organisations to them. As I've said, work with peer researchers where possible, and if not, embed really strong, meaningful PPIE. You know, ask them how the research makes them feel, not just can they understand it. Let's really see what does it bring up emotionally when you ask someone about their lived experience of a lack of income, for example. Where possible, use strengths-based framing. I know it's really difficult when working with this population because so much focus is on what they lack. Recognise that there are no academic heroes. Our job is to advocate with them, not for the population. I think when we see lots of examples of people, you know, becoming the hero in these stories, and I just think it further distanced themselves from that population. So because research is not about researchers rescuing these communities, it is about working alongside them. And I think really, really important, just going to check time. Yeah, really important to be authentic. I brought up earlier that actually it was flagged as these groups of people were overly authentic, and that was classed as a negative trait. And this is where I've started to think about how different social groups, how much they value authenticity, and some groups don't. Some groups are quite reserved. I would say academics, we're very reserved people, and I think what's important is that we are authentic, and we present who we are, not just what we do, but who we are as people as well. I think that's really helpful in building trust and building a relationship with those communities. I think that's so much more important than things like, you know, get rid of titles, pretend we don't have a title. I don't understand all that. We know, you know, you see politicians do it all the time. They'll be standing in a pub with a pint. They'll be telling people their dad was a tool maker, or they'll be pretending they support football when they don't. And there's no need for it. It does not build trust. It builds distrust. So although I think this might make academics uncomfortable being authentic, I think it's really important. You know, if you're a professor who's been to private school and you're from a long line of professors and doctors, but you've noticed the social injustice and this is why you're doing it, then that's great. That's a great person to be in that room. So yeah, be authentic, because I think people have a lot more time for authentic people, especially from this community, and they really, really value it. And then I've just put some tips here. I kind of recognise that people are working in different areas in different ways, and there's only so much maybe you can do as a PhD student. It might be around doing, you know, trying to be as accessible as possible and working with those trusted communities and just reflecting on your own positionality. When you become a postdoc and you might be applying for your own funding, you can start to really, you know, embed inclusion in the study design. I think professors have a really great opportunity to try and shift culture and model inclusive leadership. You know, so, you know, sitting on funding panels and say, are you measuring socioeconomic deprivation? Challenging that sort of sometimes the deficit focus of this population, supporting people from different backgrounds to come into academia. You know, I wouldn't have had an academic career if it wasn't for my line manager, who I know she's not on this call, she's in clinic today, so it's fine, I won't embarrass her. But she was able to see potential. You know, I'm never the most polished sounding person in a room. I might not have always had the best CV, but she saw a lot of potential and she helped me grow. So I think where you've got space to do that, I think it can really help, because it gets these communities into academia, so that they're not always just the group that are being researched on. They're actually, you know, they're within academia. PPI members already do fantastic work. You know, if you're from this population, then giving up your time is absolutely fantastic and it's really valued. If you're not from this population, but a PPI member, then I think keep challenging where you see that research isn't accessible, or whether perhaps stigmatizing language and assumptions are being used. So there's lots of space where we can all do little things. And I co-designed some resources. My colleague Abby Woodward, here's the reference, and you know, I don't expect you to be able to see this. We put together some infographics as well around how you can work with voluntary and community sector organisations, as well as this population. They're available within that paper, so check it out if you want some more real specific examples. But yeah, in summary, I would say stay curious, as I said at the start. Recognise and challenge discrimination, measure it, be intersectional, recruit from a wide range of settings, and use all these frameworks and resources for, depending on what your research focus is, you know, dip into them and see what's helpful. Use proper use of peer researchers and co-design methods, not an add-on, you know, do it scientifically really well, and then build trust through understanding the population and who they are and being authentic. And then the references I've used throughout are at the end here for people who might want to delve into the different references in a bit more detail. But thank you, that's me. That's my talk done.
Amazing. Thanks so much, Megan, for sharing your knowledge, your huge amount of knowledge in this area, providing such a helpful context around this area as well, and your experiences. Thanks for being so kind of honest and candid. We've had a lot of comments in the chat, just a lot of agreement, some questions around terminology, some questions around references that we can come back to you. But if anyone has any has a question that they might want to ask, we probably have time for one or two. Just keeping an eye on the chat. So many comments about how wonderful the session was. Enrico, would you like to come in with a question? I'll just see if I can unmute you so you can ask it yourself. So you should be able to unmute yourself now, Enrico.
Hiya, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can. Thank you.
Yes, fantastic. Thank you so much, Megan, for this really interesting session. I had a question around, you mentioned the lived experience, which was actually really nice to hear. I think a lot of academics don't talk about their own lived experience. I was curious to know a little bit more about how, if you share your lived experience also with participants, and what is sort of their reaction. So I do research with unpaid carers, and I also have lived experience as unpaid carer, and I'm sometimes not sure, shall I share this information with participants or not, because of course I don't want to make it about myself. I want to make it about them, but then I also want to sort of make them feel at ease that they're sort of talking to a peer as well, rather than a researcher. So I was just wondering what would be your recommendation or guidance.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting one. And again, as I said, academics, we tend to be a bit reserved, don't we? We don't tend to reveal much about ourselves. I think it really does depend on the situation. I think even when we share our lived experience, we have to still remember that there's that power imbalance, right? So even if we're in the room as the academic, even if we have some shared lived experience, we don't want to dominate the conversation with that. I don't tend to talk too much about my background when I'm with them, because I find that I'm more reflective of my situation now, and I'm not experiencing socioeconomic deprivation now. So I'm a little bit more reflective, and I personally don't choose to do that. I have today, but I wouldn't typically. So I think there can be real value in sharing some of your experiences, but just acknowledging that, you know, there is still that power imbalance. and that we don't dominate the conversation. But Enrico, I know you, and I know you wouldn't do that anyway.
Thanks,
Thank you very much.
Megan. Thanks, Enrico. We've got a couple of questions. Maybe we can get through both of them if we're fast. Someone has asked, what are the ethics application procedure if we involve people with socioeconomic deprivation as peer researchers? Are there any resources that maybe you could guide people towards?
Yes, there was a research around a link on the slide. These are going to be circulated, aren't they? So they click on that link and it takes them to about ethics with peer researchers. Yeah, so I think that's all there, and there's sort of guidance for when you're applying for ethics, or just more broadly ethical considerations when you work with peer researchers. Yeah.
Perfect, thank you. And possibly a nice question to finish on. Could you share more on how we could take more asset or strength-based approaches?
So it's really, really hard, because social economic deprivation is around the lack of something. What I tend to do is also think around communities and the culture, and you know, considering what there are strengths of this, there are huge strengths in these communities. So I think it's really hard, because unless you're talking about class, you can't really talk about it in too much of a positive way. So I would just, I would focus a little bit on culture where you can. What are the strengths, the individual strengths and the cultural strengths of these populations that make them so resilient, and maybe learn from them about what they feel their strengths are, because there are so many strengths that we overlook a lot in research. I think when we're trying to fix a problem, we focus on what's the problem, how do we fix that problem, and we can overlook some incredible strengths of this community.
I think that's a really nice point to end on. So just to say a really big thank you, Megan, for your time today, and thank you everyone for joining us as well, and your engagement throughout the session. As we've said, we'll follow up with the slides and the link to the recording once it's up on our YouTube. I think, Megan, your contact details are on the slides as well, so if anyone wants to follow up, they can get in touch with you. And there were a few questions about references in the chat, so we'll follow up and try and get those over to everyone who attended. But yeah, just a huge thank you to everyone, and thanks again to Megan.
Thank you so much. Thanks for
so much,
organising.
everyone. Have a lovely afternoon.
Bye. 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 Bye.
Bye.